On today's show, the 2023 San Diego Padres headed into the season with World Series blockbuster expectations, but they were more akin to a nightmare carousel filled with radioactive waste that was cruising along the pits of Tartarus. On today's show, talking about my picks for the most miserable, sad moments of the season, as well as some suggestions from you, the listeners, the commenters, the viewers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Friday, October 13th. Everybody be careful. Everybody be careful. I am just now realizing that. As always, I'm your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You can follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, that's Javiipeno, or at LO_Padres if you only want updates about the show, or if you want my personal takes on dumb comics and random nonsense about everything. I do tweet about the Padres, but you get my point. Or you can check out the YouTube channel, Locked On Padres on YouTube, to not just see whatever fit I'm rocking, to not just see Pac-Man and Tatis, but to see a temporary return of the Jester hat. Because on today's episode, everybody, we're doing Jester activities. We are discussing the most miserable moments of this season, my personal picks, as well as you, the listeners, some of yours that were sent to me on Twitter and DM to me a couple times. Just a fun episode. And I think that this is a programming note. I'm going to try and make every Friday like a fun little topic, or at least something that involves you, the listeners. I want to involve the listeners a little bit more. Maybe feature your comments and whatnot in the video, what have you, and might just do a mailbag next week. I'm actually going to put out a request for that probably on Monday, so stay tuned for that. I just think that'll be a fun way to shake up the off season, because who doesn't like a little pun bit, Friday fun day, whatever you want to call it, fun Friday follower day. I don't know. I'll think about the exact terminology and what order to rearrange it in. But for today, let's discuss the most miserable moments. It is no secret, I have basically been crying on this podcast almost as much as Braves fans, frankly, over just the last 3 days, except that I levied it out throughout the course of the last 5-6 months. It's basically been nothing but misery, talking about the San Diego Padres, and I wanted to talk about just my picks for the most miserable moments. And this is a safe space. This is where if you want to leave comments below on the YouTube channel, or message me about your thoughts on this too, go ahead, air it all out, because this was really a frustrating season. And I think that if you weren't a Padres fan, you could probably tell from afar that this was a frustrating season, with some of the crazy stat numbers on how bad they were in extra innings and one-score games, all that stuff, really, really rough. But I think that if you were a Padres fan, it was especially more rough, just to see all of this go to waste, and to watch day in and day out a team that just seemingly had no fight to them. So without further ado, let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go with my first pick. I actually think a really underrated one, Joe Musgrove's injury. Yeah, I know this isn't the most crazy one. We're going to kind of go from, least to most in this order, but Joe Musgrove's injury happened. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't the reason that the Padres completely missed out on the playoffs, but it's a shame that he'd been having a really solid season. I don't usually like going by F4 for pitchers, but he did get a 2.1. He had actually had one of his better, starts in a lot of ways, and he was basically the same as ever. The strikeout rate was the same, walk rate a little bit higher. The only difference between Musgrove this year and previous years was that he started off a little bit slow because of the injury that he suffered, the weight room incident, which honestly should be part of most miserable moments. Is that's how the season started, is us hearing about our beloved Musgrove, Java Joe, getting hurt before the season even started. Maybe that was foreshadowing of what was yet to come, but we didn't know it at the time. But Musgrove getting hurt after being on a roll and really fine, getting back into it. Because like I said, the beginning of the season, he was a little bit rough. He gave up 3 earned runs in 5, then 7, I believe it was in the Mexico series. Then he had another start. He gave up 4 against the Dodgers on 8 hits. Not great stuff. And then eventually he found a groove. He had a great start against the Angels on July 4th, which I think was the peak of Padres excitement all year, frankly, is when they swept the Angels and we actually started to believe for once. When he went 7 innings, 1 earned run, and 11 strikeouts. Like, Musgrove is back, and then he ends up having to miss the rest of the season after July 28th, right before the trade deadline, which made it so rough, I think. You know what I mean? Like, just having this momentum going your way. You had the sweep against the Angels. You've had one of the better records in the entire league for the last couple of weeks, and then you have the trade deadline where you're a little bit hopeful they can make some moves, and then Musgrove goes down, which is almost puts a pit in your stomach and almost halts any progress you almost feel that the team could make at the deadline. You know what I mean? So that to me is one of the ones that I don't think gets talked about enough. But man, was it rough. It was rough, ladies and gentlemen. The next one I want to talk about, the season opener. The season opener. This one, I don't know if this is worse than the Musgrove injury. It probably isn't because of the grand calculus. You know, it is still just games 1, 2, and 3 of a 162 game season. But I still thought that it was so frustrating that the Padres started off getting their butts kicked by the Rockies. And they, for some reason, are just incapable of playing this team. CJ Cron is just a nightmare, and he turns into Barry Bonds specifically and only when he plays the Padres, which is super frustrating. Don't get me wrong. He's a divisional opponent. That's why we get to see him more. But, like, it was maddening. I mean, he hits like 3 home runs in this series, if I recall correctly. He was just like an absolute beast. And again, it's really frustrating because this is not a bad player. You know what I mean? I think that the Padres actually could have used a player like him this year instead of someone like, Matt Carpenter, quite frankly. But it still just says so much that he just absolutely murders the Padres. He had an OPS of 1729 against the Padres this year in 4 games. Like, that's obscene how good he was against the Padres. And if you looked at like his career splits, I bet you they're not all that far off. Like, I don't know what it is that CJ Cron becomes Barry Bonds as long as he's playing against the Padres. And then nowhere else, and sometimes not even in Coors Field, is he that effective. But that's just, yeah, again, he has an OPS over 1,000 against the Padres. So he's very good against them. But to start off your season losing to a middling Rockies team that just is miserable, basically all the time, just really rough. And I think that we will never forget it. Losing 2-7 in the first game, 1-4 in the next game, and then finally they do bounce back and win the next 2. But those couple to start things off, really annoying and really frustrating. But this probably should have been the last ranked one, but whatever. You get my point, guys. I just wanted to rant about CJ Cron because, my God, man, what is up with you? The next one I want to talk about is, and we haven't gotten into the real juicy stuff, you know what I mean? And again, we're going to save audience responses later. Some of them overlap just a tad bit. But next one I want to talk about, Ji-Man Choi. And in general, the MLB trade deadline. Now, it wasn't a bad deadline in the moment. I wrote about it actually for Just Baseball. You could go look that up. And I actually thought that what the Padres did at the trade deadline was awesome, frankly. I thought it was a really cool sort of, low budget, nothing too extreme, not giving up your farm, like not trading Jackson Merrill for like a superstar player or anything like that. Or frankly, just like a decent player because we know how Preller can be. But they trade for a mixed bag. I think Garrett Cooper was really solid. And he was definitely better than Matt Carpenter and some of the other players that had been hitting DH for them all year. And Scott Barlow had a couple moment or two, even though he, got lit up a couple times. He was at least like, he had some moments. He had some moments, and I didn't mind the trade. I thought it was a very smart one. But then Ji-Man Choi and Rich Hill. My God. Rich Hill finished his season with the Padres, I believe, with an ERA of 1,072, if I am not mistaken, with the Padres. Again, he finished the year with a 5.41 ERA, but with the Padres this season, again, he's been in the league forever. He finished with a 8.23. So I literally was joking, and I was still kind of close. He was disastrous. And then Ji-Man Choi, I think, is the funniest one. I actually had tweeted back when a couple like a month or so ago, at one point, I had said that Ji-Man Choi and me have the same number of career hits with San Diego Padres because he was hitless for the longest time. And this was a guy who was supposed to be awesome against, I think it was lefties. if I'm not mistaken. I don't have the numbers in front of me. And instead, he only got like one hit. He slugged below 100. It was really frustrating and very classic Padres that even for a player that was supposed to be, he's better against, what's it called? I think he's better against righties. And then Cooper for lefties. So it was supposed to be a nice little addition where you're like, all right, cool, we get these two depth pieces that are going to improve things. And he never even got it hit. Like, until basically it was too late. I don't even remember seeing Ji-Man Choi get his first career hit with the Padres. And it was frustrating. Yeah, he had some walks at the beginning. And yeah, it's true that it was a little bit unfair to bash a guy when he was like 0 for 6. But when you're like 0 for 25, it was just like, this is classic Padres. And they did not get from any of these players what other teams had gotten. Like, so let's say the Miami Marlins, who made the playoffs, like they acquired some low cheap options like Josh Bell and Jake Berger, who were actually awesome for them. So it was just really frustrating that the team that we traded with, actually ended up finding the actual gems from the postseason. Because, man, oh man, really frustrating stuff. But that's not even close to the real, like the earthly death core of, I'm just making up terms now. The really, really rough stuff. We're just in the crust. You know what I mean? Of the earth right now. We're not even close to the molten core. Heck, I would argue we're only in the stratosphere, ladies and gentlemen. It's rough. But before we continue on, I just want to tell you guys a quick thing about our friends over at Sleeper. You know I love Sleeper so much. MLB playoffs, they're here. There's plenty of superstars. And you want to play daily fantasy? Well, there's still plenty of stars left. Don't worry. Yeah, we lost Acuna and the crybaby Braves. I get it. But the team that beat them certainly ate out. You could bet on Bryce Harper. You can do stuff for the Arizona Diamondbacks, rival of the San Diego Padres, Corbin Carroll, Lourdes Gurriel Jr., Christian Walker, dare I say one of the most underrated players in the league at this point. Plenty of guys to still go in for fantasy daily over at Sleeper. Home runs, strikeouts, hits, walks, over-unders. They have all sorts of available options for you to take a shot at. And it's really cool. Players can take you to win up to 100 times your money. All sorts of stuff. It's great. And just in general, I also love their app when it comes to fantasy football. Love it very much. You can nickname your players. You can use whatever picture you want on the top. You could see a total. Like, you could just click the games from the day and they show you every player's fantasy point from that day. You can do 3-team trades. You could do all sorts of really cool stuff, quality of life changes. So I highly recommend Sleeper, guys. And use the promo code LOCKEDON, back to the daily fantasy part of things, for a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. But again, that is up to $100 match on your first deposit when you use promo code LOCKEDON. Go check it out. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, here on the Locked On Padres podcast. Be sure to go check out SiriusXM for the pod and the play-by-play broadcast of your hometown Padres. And thank you for making us your first listen every day, free and available on all platforms. Was it the first listen I imagined for some of you today? Apologies. I went to bed at like 7:30 in the morning, so I didn't have time. Like, I apologize. But nonetheless, here we are, ladies and gentlemen. We are continuing the discussion of the most miserable moments. And fear not, listeners, we will get to listener responses later. But now we get into a little bit of the really rough stuff. The next one I want to talk about is the 8-run inning that the Padres gave up to the Dodgers. This one also is more of an isolated incident in some ways, similar to the previous ones that we've mentioned already. The Padres had been up. They scored 5 in one inning against the Dodgers. It was an afternoon game, I believe, on Sunday. And the vibes were good. They had just made a big comeback the night before. It was the only comeback I feel like they had literally all season. They scored like 7 runs in an inning against the Dodgers, or maybe 8. And then the very next day when you're up, and Seth Lugo, who had been very effective for basically the whole season. Don't get me wrong. He'd have some blow-up starts, and I had predicted that he was due to regress a little bit. Although some people were leaving comments saying, hey, you did say Lugo was due for regression. He was, and he gives it up in this game, but he kind of bounced back after that. And so I was wrong about that. I thought he was going to regress a little bit more sharply. But anyway, that's another thing entirely. We'll save that for his player season review that we do maybe next week. But in terms of that, to be up 5-0 on the Dodgers after you came back, and then you have an inning after you're up by 5, to give up 8 it was just rough, and it was all line drives, all home runs. Mookie hit one, all these guys. Pretty sure Will Smith hit one. Will Smith loves to kill us too. Just a really frustrating moment, and was kind of indicative of their season, that every time you feel like they're crawling from underneath the dirt of the casket that you've been buried alive in, the buried alive feeling of following the Padres season this year, they would always do stuff like this. And they just had, again, it's just incredible how allergic they were to losing and how allergic they were to going on any win streak until literally September, when they finally won more than 3 games in a row. So really bad moment. That's on there for me. Another moment, speaking of a little bit more isolated incidents, but I actually think that this was one of the first times that I officially was like, this is it. I really think that it was here. And I know that some people will say, oh, I knew it from June. Whatever. I am going to go back to the Giants' double walk-off against the Padres. What I mean by double walk-off is getting walked off 2 nights in a row. One of them being a manager error, blip, whatever you want to call it, arguably, by Bob Melvin, in which he used Luis Garcia instead of Josh Hader, who apparently, and we didn't know definitively until later, that he was just not down, essentially, for pitching 4 outs or going 2 innings or whatever. And again, we would learn more about that later. But the Giants, man. And again, this was back in June. So it was like we still had plenty of time left, but there was a feeling with when this happened. And then you had all the questions about Bob Melvin. You had people calling for his head on Twitter. It was really rough. And you bring in Luis Garcia, and he blows it. Shocker. And Mike Yastrzemski hits a walk-off home run. Patrick Bailey gets the sac fly. There's a wild pitch as well from Garcia. And who was it that gives up the game-winning home run? I believe it was Ray Kerr comes in, gives up the game-winning home run. Really stinky to waste a game that the Padres have been dominating basically the whole way through, thanks to guys like Soto and Tatis. And then you lose the next game on a walk-off after an absolutely lovely start from Seth Lugo, in which he only gave up 1 run, and then Nick Martinez came in and gave up 2. Just really rough stuff for the Padres. Getting walked off twice in a row. That was the first time where I was like, guys, this team's energy, it's just unbelievable. And remember, they had just come off of beating the Rockies 3 out of 4, beating the Guardians 2 out of 3. We're getting really excited. They even split a series against the Cubs, which was pretty good. And then they beat the Rays, one of the best teams in baseball, 2 out of 3 games. And then you follow that up by getting embarrassed 3 out of 4 games, losing those close games. And just, yeah, I mean, absolutely awful, absolutely atrocious. And it still bothers me to this day. And speaking of close games, I think that we have to talk about this. Actually, no, not yet. Not yet. First, I want to talk about a more general one. And it is the linked tweet on the Locked On Padres event. My next one for most miserable moment is the whole season whenever you heard the term runners in scoring position. Every time, the amount of times I had to bring that up with people, what's going on with the Padres? That's basically it. In a lot of ways, like they just refused to hit with runners on, and it was maddening to watch. Because most of the time, maybe not most of the time, but there were a good amount of times, and I really think that like the series, don't get me wrong, the Padres are basically eliminated at this point, but against, who was it that they were playing against? I'm forgetting who it was that they played against at the end of the season in order to keep things alive. It might have been the White Sox, but I'm not entirely sure. Was it against the Giants, maybe? Cardinals? Rockies? I'm trying to remember. I think it was against the Cardinals. It could have been against the Cardinals. I forgot which is I think this is the game that they end up blowing. Yeah, I think it's against the Cardinals. They lose 2-5 in this game in the top of the 11th, thanks to giving up a bunch of runs. But to me, this one emphasized the runners in scoring position thing, and I thought it was poetic that basically their whole momentum officially died after you had the bases loaded, and then you had Bogarts, Tatis, Soto coming up. And all you got out of that, and by the way, nobody out, and all you got out of that was a Xander Bogaerts fielder's choice. Incredible stuff from this team. Manny Machado double plays, all that stuff. Just like, I really think that was a good microcosm, though. I think Trent Grisham, to just move on to my next one, Trent Grisham bunting with the bases loaded and Dave Roberts practically mocking him in the postgame, that's up there for most miserable moments of the year for sure. But in general, runners in scoring position, it was the case all year, and it's just frustrating that so many times, like this Cardinals game, it would be like first and second. And we've got the top of the order. We've got Kim. We've got Tatis. We've got occasionally Grisham, Bogarts, and Machado, and Soto, and all these guys. And the fact that like that is why I had a little bit of a problem with some people saying the Padres' issue is depth, because they did have a depth issue, but they actually remained relatively healthy, so they didn't necessarily need it all year, and they got decent seasons out of guys like Ha-Seong Kim, Gary Sanchez, Luis Campusano, which should have been enough to at least make it, as long as you guys aren't the worst in the league at driving runners in, then they should have been fine. And while you might say, oh, well, there's plenty of teams with good lineups that drive people in. Yeah, but those teams don't have blockbuster players that just got signed to $80 bajillion deals, right? And have been all-star MVP candidates before. That was what was so frustrating about this Padres team all year. Arguably, runners in scoring position, just hearing that might be number one for most miserable. But I actually want to get a little bit creative with the last bunch, because I think that these, I don't know if they're worse than runners in scoring positions and stuff, but I just think that they spoke more to the dysfunction of the Padres this season than I think this one did, which was more just playing horribly, if that makes any sense. But before we get into that, ladies and gentlemen, just real quick, I want to talk to you guys about another classic sponsor of this podcast that we love oh so very much. That's the good folks over at FanDuel. As you know, October baseball's back, man. Again, we're watching the Braves fans cry, the Dodger fans, the so-called 90s Yankees dynasty of the Dodger fandom. Just really rough times for them. But don't worry, you can make your postseason debut with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, even if you are a Braves or Dodgers fan, guys. Join FanDuel today and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to create your new account. Then you get in on the action from the first pitch until the final third out of that bottom nine, ladies and gentlemen. Bet on everything from strikeouts to home runs to who's going to win the game, over-unders, all that stuff. Again, head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon right now. $200 bonus bets guaranteed. Locked on, guys. Locked on. We got you covered. Go check it out. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, here on the Locked On Padres podcast. My final four most miserable moments of the 2023 Padres season that I think are a little bit different than just playing poorly, in my opinion, at least. Let's get into them. You ready? The fourth I'm going to say is Austin Nola. And this hasn't been talked about enough. It coming out that he had an issue with his sight. And Austin Nola is someone that I once called a Nepo baby on this podcast. How do I put this? I stand by my criticisms of Nola, and that I think this is kind of something irrespective of knowing that he had this injury, but I still stand by my criticism that bottom line, just end result, how were you not taking this guy out and putting Campusano in sooner? I had no idea why that was happening. I thought it was maddening. I thought Campusano should have been the starter opening day practically. He wasn't. And every time Campusano would start to get on a roll, get you a couple hits, they would bench him and then put him back Austin Nola. I don't know if that's a manager thing. I don't know if that's a general manager thing. Maybe you're feeling bad because you missed on that Ty France trade. I don't know. But in terms of just in the moment, I was always frustrated. But then when it came out, similar to when it came out that Anthony Rizzo of the Yankees, who also had a relation to the Padres because Tatis ran into him and that's what caused it, Rizzo having a concussion, and they literally, if you look up his stats, ever since he got hit by Tatis in the head unintentionally, as he was trying to get back to first, that Rizzo became the worst batter in all of baseball. And it's like, well, yeah, because he's concussed. And it's just funny that the Yankees, one of the 5 biggest sports franchises in the world, doesn't just say, hey, this is really weird that he's so bad. Let's run something on him. Let's go look at the day that he got hurt. One of the biggest sports franchises in the world didn't figure that out. They have all the resources in the world. They have all these people. How does no one figure this out? He practically played for a month and a half. Austin Nola, same sort of thing. And this reading from, Jeff Sanders of the San Diego Union Tribune, Nola had not played since August 2nd and was finally placed on El Paso's injured list Saturday. The official diagnosis is oculomotor dysfunction, a vision issue that impacts the brain's ability to coordinate eye movement. It could provide an answer as to why Nola wasn't tracking the ball as well as he was in spring training. I mean, again, it's just like stuff like this seems to only happen to teams that are just very unserious. You don't see the Philadelphia Phillies randomly have a player who's been playing poorly and then Trey Turner, and then it comes out, oh, he was missing a finger the whole time or whatever. I'm exaggerating, but you get my point. I just think it reflects, the Padres organization sometimes that they didn't realize this. Very similar to the Yankees. So that was, of course, awful. Next one. I'm going to go with Josh Hader refusing to pitch for my third most miserable moment. This has been talked about a lot. Josh Hader's comments afterwards saying, I can't do everything by myself, blah, 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 to paraphrase. Just the loser energy all over the place. And this is a guy that didn't want to be traded at the deadline. And the Padres didn't trade at the deadline despite the fact that they probably were going to re-sign him. And I still don't think they're going to re-sign him. And you could have gotten a top 100 prospect. I promise you could have got a top 100 prospect for Josh Hader, the best relief pitcher probably in the sport right now, especially with guys like Edwin Diaz out and some other people having some down seasons. And like all of that, and the guy won't go 4 outs when you're in the middle of a playoff race. There's a couple things. One, loser energy from Hader 1000%. That's insane. Like, what are we doing here? They're still in the playoffs, and you just, like, you're that worried that something bad's going to happen that you won't go 4 outs and you won't go on back-to-backs or whatever it is. And number 2, that also blame needs to also be placed on the Padres organization to not be aware of this and not have that connection established to know that we're not going to be in a situation where this guy that we could have got a lot from at the deadline won't just be like, hey, by the way, I'm not pitching in certain situations if it doesn't suit my interests. That's something you need to know, and if you do know that, you need to trade him. I'm not entirely against Hader. Again, I think it was loser energy from him like the rest of the team had all year, but this one was specific, it was different, and them losing that game, and then Bob Melvin after the game, that interview, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Him just saying, yeah, that's what we're doing now, in response to why he didn't use Hader. Yeah, okay, Manny. Those reports were definitely just a narrative being pushed out there. The manager literally said, I don't know what to do, in response to why they didn't use their all-star closer. But yeah, Manny, definitely those reports were completely off base and ridiculous. So that just and it's funny because this happens a few days after the reports, which leads me to my number 2 thing, which is the San Diego Union Tribune article and the Athletic article discussing the Padres' dysfunction, everything from Preller as a micromanager, how players don't know who to follow between Preller and Melvin, and how it's like taking sides and parents getting divorced, all that stuff. The lack of not accountability, but a cultural problem. You had Manny Machado being under a little bit of fire with not being necessarily the biggest clubhouse leader, maybe in the world, although it's a little bit difficult to say because he's always there at least, and he's always plays hard and all these things, and he could have got surgery on his. Was it his elbow or his shoulder? I think it was his elbow. I forgot for sure what it was, and I don't want to look it up right now to interrupt my flow. But he withheld that because they weren't officially eliminated. So, I don't necessarily believe that Manny is, doesn't care at all. But maybe it's just not working. And for 2 articles to come out like this, it really just speaks to the issues here. And the issues are that the team just wasn't on the right page. Maybe there's something to be said for the mercenary nature of this team where nobody outside Tatis and Campuzano are really theirs in a lot of ways in terms of farm system, which is why I really don't want them to trade Jackson Merrill or Ethan Salas or any of those guys, because I want to have some farm dudes that are our own. But that moment, just absolutely atrocious. It really was. It really was. And I think that it gave me a lot of stuff to talk about. And it really solidified my belief that if you're going to fire anybody, it should be AJ Preller. I did believe that because I think that he's more responsible for cultural stuff. I think that he has had plenty of managers. And if we're talking about firing Melvin, it's like, bro, most managers, they don't get to hire half as many managers that AJ Preller has hired. From Andy Green to Bud Black to Jace Tingler to Bob Melvin, whatever you want, whatever floats your boat. That's pretty upsetting and embarrassing, frankly. So those are really bad. I imagine you guys all agree. But my number one, looking back, I don't even know if this is number one. I don't even know. I feel like the Melvin conference after the Hater situation, or just the in general runners and scoring position thing, might be worse. But for number one, I am going with tying the extra innings record set by the 1969 Astros for the worst record in extra innings in the history of Major League Baseball. 1969 Expos, ladies and gentlemen. 1969 Expos. Can I leave it there? Can I leave it there? Because that's like astounding. Again, the Padres, we all thought they were going to make history. Well, they certainly did. It just wasn't in the way we expected. They end up finishing the season with a 2-12 record in extra innings. They won their last 2 of the 14, which was cute. But it just and I'm going to be honest with you guys. Hate me all you want. I was 100% rooting for it. I wanted them to break the record. I really did, because I'm a masochist and I just wanted something more to complain about. And in general, obviously the 1-run splits, 9-23. If you just go, so what is that? 9 plus, so that's 32 games, if I'm not mistaken. If you just go 16-16, if you go 14-17, if you go 13-18, the Padres are in the playoffs and probably want the second wild card. That shows you just how bad they were in close games this year. And the extra innings thing has the record attached to it. So that's my number one. Really bad. What can I say? But guys, I don't lie on this show. You know me. I'm a man of my word. You know what I mean? Let's talk about some of your responses on Twitter. I posed the question, in honor of the Dodgers, what were some of the most disappointing, heartbreaking Padres moments from this year? Andres Rivera, shouts to my guy, longtime listener of the show. Game on July 31st on a Monday night. Me and Pops had tickets, pretty good seats at Coors Field, and like a 2-hour rain delay. Game started at 9 local time, still pouring, went into extras, bases loaded, no outs, and boom, no one scored. We lost, went home at midnight wet, sad. What can I say, Andres? That is perfect, and that is miserable to sit through the rain and all these things and for you to lose at extras. But yeah, bases loaded, nobody out. I've heard that before, and based on Xander Bogaerts' numbers, he was probably a culprit for that one, if I remember properly. Next up, Chris Finley on Twitter, at CFinley79medic, says, thinking if we only won a handful of those extra inning games, we would have been in the playoffs. Yeah. That's a great point. That should have belonged to mine, honestly, in a lot of ways. I should have mentioned that if they literally just won some, they'd be in the playoffs. Just some, right? 2-12, so what is that, 14 games? If you go 7-7, if you go 6-8, if you go 5-9, that would have made a huge difference. But no, they only won 2. And it was only, and by the way, it should be mentioned, they only won some games in extra innings when their chances were like officially evaporated, which says a lot. And I think, as someone who doesn't like to look and assume that people don't feel anything, I think also speaks to how lack of clutch they were. You know what I mean? I still remember after they lost that Cardinals game that I mentioned, the great microcosm that killed their win streak, that the fact that they then followed that up with 8 runs the next day in like 4 innings shows you exactly what this team's energy was all year. As soon as it doesn't matter, up by 5, boom. Best team in the history of the sport since Murderers Row. If you're down by 2, might as well call them the Royals. Might as well call them the Charlotte Bobcats, for God's sake. Really, really rough. Next up, Gavin at Padres Hub said, Mookie's home run off of Hader with 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th to tie the game. We were never the same after that. This was going to be mine too, but not going to lie. When Gavin tweeted at it, I said, I'll leave it. Shouts to my dude. This is a great, great one, and probably should be on the top 10 too. You need wins against the Dodgers. Simple as that, right? Like, you need wins against a team like that. And the bottom of the 9th, like, especially with Mookie. And for me, you know what also makes it really frustrating is that they, it's and this has nothing to do with the Dodgers or the Padres, but just knowing that the stupid Red Sox gave him up for a pack of veggie straws in Alex Verdugo and 2 prospects that aren't even like on their team anymore makes it even more frustrating. That's like, of course. Like, and this one isn't even, like, this is just other teams helping out the Dodgers practically, right? Really, really rough. It's like when Freddie Freeman signed there, or when they gave them Trey Turner, Max Scherzer for basically nothing. Like, it's a frustrating moment in that regard too. But yeah, in the bottom of the 9th, and I believe on national television, Josh Hader, the best closer in the game, giving up that home run for a guy who had been great all year. It was like, of course you finally blow up. Like, you couldn't blow up when it was like a 5-1 game and you give up 2, and it's like, it's okay, like, whatever, it's a random game. No, of course not. It's national TV against the Dodgers, I agree. And 21 average responds saying, yep, I screamed when he hit the ball. Sir, I screamed as well, and it was just inside. On the inside, I screamed. And I feel like cried on the inside as well, too. MBB, I don't know how to say your Twitter name, at Hotbreaks. Crazy handle. I'm surprised. It's kind of a cool handle to have. I don't know why. It's just like so plain. Watching Grisham swing. Oh, man. Yeah, the amount of times I saw Grisham swing through fastballs that had a little bit of horizontal movement across the plate, just really rough. And the amount of times that he would hit little dribblers in the infield, really rough. And I want to once again reiterate the bases loaded bunt with no outs that Dave Roberts roasted him for. I'm really done with Grisham in terms of believing that he can do it here. If you are another team, there are worse players to take a flyer on. Good defender at the minimum, has some power. I'd be interested. I'd be interested because I don't think you'd have to give up too much for him. And I think the Padres might save some money that way. So I'm personally done, and I think, as I've talked about before, that good center fielders seems to be a common denominator amongst World Series caliber teams. At least most of them, not all of them. And the fact that you've had Grisham for like 4 years now, maybe potentially going on 5th, just feels like it's like, why aren't we addressing a giant problem here? It just doesn't look like it's going to happen. But I agree with you, maybe watching Grisham swing. Another one that I got from a quote tweet that I posted actually this morning from Glenn Otto apologist, my guy Josh. Shouts to you, man. Hopefully go to DC again. Maybe we'll run into each other again or something. I don't know. Whenever I leave, I'll let you know, because apparently you might just be at a game that I'm at. That's crazy. But shout out to Josh. The Mookie home run off of Hader when we were up by 1 in the 9th. Great minds think alike. That probably should have been on my top 10. Last one, at SD Fan 21, losing 5 of 6 to the Pirates, losing 2 of 3 at home to the Royals, poor hitting with runners in scoring position, blown bullpen leads, the poor records in 1-run games and extra innings. Most of that I've already discussed, so I won't trample over it again. But losing 5 of 6 to the Pirates, yeah, I forgot to mention that. Carlos Santana was another CJ Cron. Carlos Santana actually had like a low-key pretty good season. I think I mentioned on the show that I would have loved to trade for him. He's been a decent player for a while, so it's not quite as frankly insulting as CJ Cron going off against us. But yeah, Carlos Santana killed us, losing 5 of 6 to that team. Disgraceful. And very similar to in 2021, when I think they also had a bad record against the Pirates that year. So maybe that tells us something. Losing 2 of 3 at home to the Royals. Oh yeah. I believe that was like after the Pirates stuff, and then you lost the Royals, and that's when everyone was like, oh my God, what's going on here? This is awful. The poor hitting. Blown bullpen leads is the last thing to mention here. Yeah, man. Blown bullpen leads, worth talking about. The Padres bullpen this year, if you look at high leverage versus low leverage situations, there's a decent amount of them that got much worse throughout points of the year. Garcia, Martinez, Suarez a little bit. Granted, he came back later. Nabil Krismat, remember that whole thing? Really bad. Really bad for sure. But in the end, that's the Padres season, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you all for sending in your responses. I'm going to put out a prompt for a potential mailbag, I think, on Monday that we will do for next Friday. It'll be anything, though. I haven't done a mailbag in a really long time. I'd love you guys to ask questions. And honestly, ask questions about anything. You could ask me about my favorite One Piece episode. I don't care. You could ask me about my favorite Pac-Man game in honor of the bobblehead. I don't care. You could ask me what I think is going to happen with James Harden. I don't care. Obviously, I would prefer baseball, but if you just want to unleash because you want to hear me rant about dumb stuff, go ahead. If you want me to compare Padres to Marvel heroes, whatever you want. I don't care what it is. I'll talk about everything that I haven't already talked about on the show, obviously, in greater detail. So look for that on Monday. But with that all being said, everybody, that about does it for today's edition. Today's Fun Day Friday edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, and at LO_Padres. And check out the YouTube for my hats and my silly guys and my silly vibes. Until next time, until next week, stay safe, and of course, stay faithful, my Friar Faithful homies. Take care.